Oh, hello. Thanks for dropping by for this second part of a lecture on how not to be ignorant about the world. I hope you've enjoyed Hans and Ola Rosling's very excellent video of outlining some of the steps of how not to be ignorant about the world. And I just wanted to add a few of those remarks. And so I'm going to share my screen here for a minute. And that should allow us to go where we want to go. Okay, so if you take a look here, this is the gapminder.org webpage. And this is where Hans and Ola Rosling work. Well, Ola Rosling is in charge. Hans Rosling he died a few years ago, which is sort of terribly sad. I never met him, but I do miss him. I think the world was very much better while he was on it. And in any case, the Gapminder Foundation, you can sort of read a lot about what they do. And of course, you can see the link to the video that hopefully you just saw, how not to be ignorant about the world. But I want to draw your attention to what's this thing here. This is the Gapminder test, right? So at one point in the video, Ola Rosling mentions, imagine you're going to a job interview or something, and they have this crazy questionnaire about all these questions that you don't know the answers to. Honestly, in a sense, he's not really making that up. Okay, there's a sense in which lots of times employers will sort of outsource various kinds of quiz or questionnaires because it gives them valuable information when deciding hiring. So you've probably, if you've applied for sort of any job anywhere, it's likely enough you've taken one of those like sort of personality tests, right? Or there are a bunch of these scenario questions where it says, something like, rate how much you agree or disagree with the following statements. It is okay to borrow money from the register if you intend to pay it back later, or something like that, right? Now you think to yourself, gosh, who would answer that wrongly? Well, look, if somebody did, would you hire that person, right? And so again, it's valuable information. Also, colleges and universities, including your own MCC, have been absolutely looking at what are called micro certifications. That's one name that they go by. The idea is that they can add information about little things that you do in the course of your coursework that sort of add to or provide some kind of a proof of one kind of qualification or another. You could also call them sort of badges. If you look at LinkedIn, which is kind of like Facebook for business, essentially. A lot of people make connections. A lot of people sort of get jobs this way. It's if you are thinking about being on the job market soon and don't have a LinkedIn profile, you should very much create one. It's a thing. And one of the things on LinkedIn is that there's all these old badges, right? There are things that you can sort of attach to your profile, say, oh, look, I can do this, I can do this, I've done this, I've done this, I've done this, right? And that's another form of micro certification. And so again, we here even at MCC, I've been on more than one committee talking about putting micro certifications of some kind even on transcripts. And so you might say, well, look, if we decide that global knowledge is important, in fact it is, it's one of our sort of overall broad scaled courses that everybody has to have some credit in sort of global education. We might require this as well, or we might include this as a kind of a badge or something like it. And so if you were to click on that Gapminder test, they're going to give you 13 or 14 questions that are timed. And so you don't really have time to like go and research them or look them up or something like that. And so you think, okay, if I'm facing a questionnaire of this kind sometime for some reason, perhaps with a job in the balance, how am I going to do well? And again, Ola addresses this point. And one of the things that you want to do is you want to keep in mind his sort of 4 rules, the rules of thumb. Right. I think again, most things improve. You want to think, look, most people are in the middle, right? Most, if there's something that seems to be fairly standard, think most people have this. Think in general, countries don't have to be rich in order to have various kinds of social progress, like girls in school, or vaccines, or electricity, things like that. Though these things are fairly widespread in today's world. Not to say that everybody has them, but the majority do. And if you focus on the places that don't have them, you do miss the majority. and then of course there's this idea of sharks killing very few. So if there's some issue that sort of seems very scary, or that has received a lot of media coverage, you might consider the possibility that it's sort of being that it's exaggerated. Okay, but again, these are rules of thumb. They tend to point you toward the right answer in more cases than not. And so that's the idea. If you can apply those while you're taking this Gapminder test, you should certainly do that. Now, I'm going to mention something here uh, uh, just for those who are paying attention, I guess. So if you go ahead and take this Gapminder test, and go ahead and you can take it multiple times, but again, try and do as well as you can the first time through, and really use those rules that Ola Rosling talks about. And so once you get through it, that are they sort of they have to manually process these, but they'll email you a certificate, right, of that says you've passed the Gapminder test. But one of the things you can do is you can also simply take a screenshot of the page that says, hey, you've passed, you have certified yourself as globally knowledgeable. And you can go over to the quizzes section of Blackboard. This is what it looks like. And you can see this bit here, right? This Gapminder certificate thing. This will open up a dialog where what you'll do is you will simply attach, right, your screenshot, or if you wait, I don't know how long it takes them actually until you get your certificate in the email, you can sort of you can submit that too. That's going to be available through the end of the term, and a couple of points extra credit for that one. It's not going to sort of make or break a grade, but it's a nice way, again, to reward some paying attention. All right, now for the main point, let's take a look at a really, really great tool. This is also still the Gapminder website. If you click on tools, this is what you get. And this is their sort of bubble graph system, which Hans Rosling has made famous in a number of very popular YouTube videos. Now, I'm going to make it very clear that what I'm about to do is essentially a remake of what Hans has already done. It's this is not my sort of original work here, and I'll include, when I post this to YouTube, the link to some of those in the description. But the idea is that those videos are now quite a number of years old, and so it would be, I think, against the spirit of that very video, and against what Hans and Ola have been trying to do, to just sort of replay all of that old data, even though the central message still hasn't really changed. That the world is different than what we're very often taught that the world is like. I do want to use the most up-to-date data that we can, and again, I'll be more or less following Hans's formula for presenting that data. But I want to again just give you an idea of how this thing works here. I'm going to move this little video down here so you can see. So you'll notice that there's a lot of information here. Part of the information is in color, okay? And so if you look at the yellows, that's North and South America, okay? And if you look at the orange, that's Europe and Central Asia. The red is East Asia and the Pacific, sort of Oceania, sometimes people call it. Here is South Asia, India, a number of other countries there. Then the Middle East and Northern Africa, and then this is Sub-Saharan Africa, okay, in these different colors. And you can see all of those dots, and each of those dots represents a country, okay? And so the bigger the size of the dot, the bigger the population of the country. So the dot size is population. Now, of course, you can change what the dot size indicates with a whole number of different things, but we'll keep the dot size for now. Also, you can change what the colors signify. You can look at just individual countries, right? And of course, if you look at, say, if you can sort of anticipate who's who. So this big giant bluish, or I guess teal dot here, obviously that'll be India, the second most populous country in the world. Somewhat ahead of them, this big red dot, that's of course China. You can probably guess the big yellow dot, right? The biggest dot in the Americas, that's the United States, etc. Okay, so that's the idea. It gives you a lot of information. Now, of course, you can play around with what the information is on here. And so, for example, we could change this to, any number of things. You can change it to time. You can change it to total fertility, children per woman. In fact, that's one of the things we're going to take a look at shortly. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and change it now. And this is all entirely free to use. Okay, life expectancy is another thing, but you can again, I want to say you can change it to communication. Like if you want to know how many cell phones total, or how many cell phones per 100 people there are in various countries, compared with how big people's families are. That's, you could certainly do that. You can put cell phones on one axis and total fertility on another. That's a rough. Um, Measure of family size. You can do, fixed line subscriber, like landlines per 100, internet users, how many personal computers total, or how many per 100. That's really interesting information. You can cross-reference all of that stuff with information about the economy, either aid given, aid received, various kinds of debt and trade metrics, the economic situation. And all of this is publicly funded data. This is data that international organizations, that governments collect. In general, the data is very good. It's of high quality. And again, because it's all publicly funded, it's all free. It's just that you have to have access to it. You have to have some way of taking a look at this information. Okay, you can even look at let's say a Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality across an economy. You can look at various statistics about poverty, including urban versus rural, number of people in poverty, places that have extreme poverty, etc. Okay, which that'll be relevant to some of the things we'll be talking about a little bit later in this last week of the course. And of course, you can use energy statistics, things about the environment, health statistics, infrastructure statistics. If you want to know what kind of roads various different countries have, what kind of traffic deaths they have, things about different countries' populations, about their societies, how safe they are, for example. If you want to know what people do for a living by country, and by various other things, you can really spend hours and hours and hours playing along with all this stuff, and I have. And of course, you can do it logarithmically or linearly if you remember your math class and what all that's about. But really, this is fantastic, and I very much encourage playing around with it. But for our purposes, I wanted to illustrate one of the points that Ola Rosling made and Hans Rosling made about the fact that the world is different now than we tend to get taught it is. And one of the things that you have to do to not be ignorant about the world is keep up with some of the changes, right? So sort of kind of throw away some outdated worldviews. And I want to focus on one particular outdated worldview that Hans Rosling has focused on. Right, and before ultimately going into that, I wanted to show you can look at all of these sort of preset maps and charts and things like that they've already set out here, and a number of short videos featuring Hans Rosling about how many are rich or how many are poor, how did babies per woman change in the world. You can look, how did the world population change? And so these are all, again, a few years old, as Hans died a few years ago, but they're still it's still really good, really interesting, and relevant, and I hope they'll inspire you. But I'm going to do what's one of the coolest things about this entire site. I'm going to take all of our data and I'm going to actually back it all the way up to 1800. Okay. And let's see. Let's squish this the other way. Let's do life expectancy on the x-axis and children per woman on the y-axis, because it'll look a little better. There we go. Because the left to right, the x-axis has more of a spread, just given the shape of my monitor, and so we're going to put the numbers with the smaller spread on the smaller axis. Okay, so doesn't change what's represented here, but there we go. All right. So one of the things you can do is you can sort of play. This controls the speed of the playback. If you're curious, you can sort of change the speed of how this goes. And you can sort of play all this data through the ages. Now, of course, they don't have great data for every country in the world, but wherever they do have data for various countries, they plug it in. It's here. And so what this is a cross section between life expectancy, okay, and total fertility. That is, how many, on average, how many children per woman. And again, it's a rough gauge of family size. And so if you take a look here at what this looks like, you see that looks like a big kind of shotgun blast right here in the middle of the graph. And what's interesting about the year 1800 is that for the most part, almost everybody in the world lives the same kind of life. right, and does more or less the same thing for a living. Almost everybody is involved in some form or another of agricultural labor, whether it be growing, harvesting, transporting, selling it. I mean, these are the world is largely based on agriculture, and much of that labor is done by some combination between human power and animal power. That's the way the world is, and so pretty much everybody in the world lives more or less the same kind of life, no matter where they live. And if you'll look, you'll see that the life expectancy is not very good. It's between the ages of about 30 and 40. Now, I want to be clear about this. That doesn't mean that there's a bunch of people get to about, well, a little under my age actually, and just start dropping dead. A bunch of 33-year-olds just keeling over, being like, "Oh God, I'm 33." That's what really drags these numbers down is the extremely high levels of child and infant mortality at this time. Again, you're talking about no antibiotics, to some extent a large scale lack of medical knowledge. Um, all kinds of things, right? Plus life is more dangerous in general. And so usually, so it's the high levels of child and infant mortality that really drag that figure down. If you survive childhood, you were likely enough to live into old age, but not quite on average the kind of old age that we're used to seeing now. And so that brings the average down to the low 30s. Okay, if you look at where that is. Now, if you look at this chart of total fertility here, children per woman, you'll see that the average is right here around 6. Okay, that's the average. Okay, average 6 children per woman. Just think about that for a minute, ladies and gentlemen, especially ladies. That's a rather different thing than we see now, and of course we'll see how that changes over time. But again, part of the idea is that if everybody lives in a situation, or nearly everybody lives in a situation where you're sort of on a farm, all right. I mean, think of it this way: think of your grandparents, or if you know anything about them, great grandparents. Um, if they grew up on a farm, okay, where a lot of work was required, especially as a small family farm, ask them how big their families were, right? I mean, families used to be very much bigger, again, especially where people had to do agricultural labor. If you have a sort of muscle powered farm, having more children means essentially free labor, right? That helps the farm run. In a sense, it's a source of wealth, and so you can expect then people would have incentives to have more children, and they generally did. Also, if child mortality is high, you would imagine that people would tend to then have more children to try and increase the odds that more of them would survive to adulthood, right? Who could potentially take care of them in their old age. Those are a couple of major things that have tended to drive families to be of much larger sizes in the past than they tend to be today. Now, today we're talking about a very different context, but let's push play here for a little bit and watch what happens. All right. You'll notice that as the years go by, and they're going by fairly slowly. I guess I could speed this up just a tad. Okay. So there's the War of 1812 just happened and went, and notice it had basically no effect. And you'll see every now and then some country, some of these dots will sort of really sort of migrate up, or sort of take a little dive down. Usually, when they take a little dive down, there's some kind of a disaster, or a war, or a famine, or something like that. Or a plague, for example, that tends to really change. But you'll notice that the vast majority of these dots aren't changing much at all. You've got a little bit of wiggle here and there, especially sort of a little bit of an improvement, or a little bit of of a problem, but mostly everything's static. Everyone, life is sort of the same. Here we have the American Civil War, right? Which again didn't have a huge giant impact on the whole world. But now you're going to start to see something a little funny. Okay, and I'm going to pause it once we hit roughly 1895-ish, right? But see what kind of a trend that we're seeing here. Okay. So you'll notice that some of these dots have, instead of just been kind of like wiggling around and sort of dipping and then returning to what they were before, um, or sort of raising a little bit and then going back down, or various things like that, have started to sort of creep away from the pack, right? And you see a certain sort of a color. You see most of these orange ones here, this sort of Europe and Central Asian. So what countries seem to be sort of migrating here? It looks like you've got France, okay? You've got Ireland, you've got the United Kingdom, that's Great Britain, Northern Ireland, all that. You've got Latvia, New Zealand. Switzerland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Scandinavian countries up there. You've got the Netherlands, you've got Finland, and of course you've got this yellow, the couple of yellow dots up here. What are they doing? That's the United States and Canada, right? Which are, Canada is still at that time a British, what a part of Great Britain, and the United States, of course, got its independence from Great Britain, but has a lot in common with its forebear. If you go all the way down here, you'll see, like, say, Germany, you'll see Italy, and you'll see Japan, and let's see, Cyprus. Let's see, there's another red dot around here. So there's Luxembourg, there's New Zealand there. Oh, there we go. There's Australia. Again, another British colony. And so it looks like, for the most part, it's Western Europe and sort of the Anglosphere, right? The kind of the countries that are somewhat closely aligned. Now, rack your brain for a minute and think back to history class and what's going on in the last decades of the 19th century that is causing life to be different in Western Europe and in the Americas. And so what you'll eventually come up with it's the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and so what's happening is that things are getting more mechanized, and that means that people's lives are essentially changing, and they're changing in a couple of different ways. One of the ways in which they're changing is that family sizes are getting smaller. If you look for these countries here, the family size is already down to about 4 instead of, again, 6 like the rest of the world. And life expectancies are sort of cheating on upward, right? Getting closer to the upper 40s instead of the lower 30s. And so again, part of the reason for that is it's bringing sort of wealth and advancement in terms of knowledge and techniques on how to do a lot of things, and so it's leading for sort of longer lives, tending toward healthier lives and smaller families. Right. So this is an interesting trend, and let's see how that trend continues. So watch the the some of those oranges, and the Anglosphere essentially start migrating away from the rest of the world. But notice the rest of the world's not doing a whole lot, right? And oh, hey, there was a big giant dip there. I'm going to pause for a second, and we can even replay that dip. Let's go back. 18. Oh, okay. So 1917 to 18, things really took a dive worldwide here. Notice World War I's been going on already for a couple of years, and so a lot of people will guess that that's World War One. It's not really World War One. It's something that happened during the late stages of World War One, and so that actually, in fact, some of you would have a much better chance of getting the right answer to that one now than in years past, because that was the what's the so-called Spanish flu pandemic, right? And so that's if you've heard about the most similar historical situation, or most recent similar historical situation to what we're dealing with now, that was it. And you saw what sort of an impact that had on the global life expectancy, right? And global total fertility. It really sort of dipped things down rather precipitously for about a year. And there were some aftershocks even in the subsequent time. So let's resume that. Again, you see trends continue, and in the 30s, we've got a sort of a bit of a global depression that starts to affect some places worse than others. Here's World War II, very, very disruptive. Okay, and then things sort of pick back up and sort of steam along. And I'm going to pause it again here for a second. So now you start to see some of the rest of the world has been gaining some of these advancements. I mean, this is 1950 already. Things like medicine is making leaps and bounds, and so it is making the whole world healthier. But you'll notice that it's not sort of having an equal effect everywhere, right? So this the sort of shotgun that used to be sort of up over here is now sort of migrated. Family size hasn't changed a lot, but sort of some of the health outcomes are changing, and that's all to the good. But then you'll notice this clump up here has gotten sort of much tighter. And again, these are your, sort of industrialized nations, and Japan very much industrialized during and after World War II, before, during, and after World War II. You get, again, Germany, the UK, Italy, the United States, Canada, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, etc. Right? That's pretty familiar. Okay. Now, here I want you to pay attention to what happens with China over the next few years and think about their history a little bit. Okay, you'll see China 57, oh, 58, 59. There's a major disaster and then a bounce back. That's the Cultural Revolution, right? And sort of the Great Leap Forward, as it was called. That was not so great, not so much of a leap forward. It was a disaster, huge amounts of disruption and famine, and you can read all about it. It's when it was tremendous impacts on China. And of course, you'll see once, again, China's sort of stuck over here, and you'll see what happens after Mao dies, for example. Mao will die, I think, in the early 70s, if I'm not mistaken. And oh, there we go. There, China sort of moves up. But notice what the whole world is doing here for a second. I'm going to back up for a sec before we get back into the 80s, back into sort of, like the Reagan years, etc. Okay, so take a look at, like, say, 1960. Well, let China pay it back. 62. All right, look, I want you to notice something that is the case here. You've got this sort of clump of countries here that are, they're capitalist countries that are industrially developed, right? They're, sort of fully industrial societies for the most part, and they're living fairly long lives, and they have fairly small families. You look at the average here is below 3, right? So between 2 and 3, right? This is your standard sort of 2.5 children, right? If you can imagine a family with 2.5 children, right? It's kind of like The Simpsons, right? I mean, Maggie's kind of a half a child in some sense, right? She's an infant for like 30 years. And so, but the rest of the world here is still living, still fairly, fairly much shorter lives and large families, right? And again, largely unindustrialized, right? I mean, there's some industrialization going on here, but it's not widespread. And the terminology that people used to use to talk about the divide between these two very different worlds, these two very different ways of life here on this planet, they used to talk about the first world and the third world. And you might say, what happened to the second world? Okay, so the first world was, capitalist industrial countries. The second world were communist industrial countries like the Soviet bloc, right? Russia and some of the satellite nations. And then, of course, the third world were unindustrialized nations. And in the 1960s, that was absolutely true. That terminology actually meant something. Okay, but let's see what happens as time moves forward. Right, you've already sort of seen a little bit of this. We backed up here a minute ago, but watch what happens. Right, you'll see that there's a pretty steady and even accelerating, right, trend all the way toward the sort of bottom and, the bottom right of the graph, right? The whole world is moving quicker and quicker and quicker to smaller families, to longer lives, right? And what's going on here, right? We'll just sort of let it run its course because it's kind of pretty, right? As things all sort of moosh together. Again, look at the speed, and it looks like the speed is much higher the further up and to the left it is. And that's true, actually. The progress that's being made in the areas that are unindustrialized is more and more and more rapid every year. And that's, it's serving to transform, the whole world, right? Okay, now look how many countries are below, right? This, and of course, China has made all this, makes a lot of press for its like sort of one child policy, but frankly, there's sort of a population decline even prior to the input of that policy. And if you look at all kinds of other places that don't have such policies, you see that there's a trend toward many fewer than 2 children per woman, right? The average family size is really quite small in most of the world, right? And not very much higher in a lot of the rest of it. Of course, there's some exceptions, but again, this is a handful of exceptions, and they tend to be in some, again, it tends to be in sub-Saharan Africa. That tends to be the lag. Now, there are a number of reasons for this. Colonialization has certainly had a long shadow over, especially sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of exploitation has occurred there, and that doesn't help. Some of the political stability in some places has not been what certainly the people who live there would have hoped for. Although there are notable exceptions, there's some very good governments in sub-Saharan Africa. There are also some very bad ones. There are certainly HIV and AIDS had a much higher impact right, on sub-Saharan Africa. In general, diseases in general have had a much larger impact there. Tropical diseases are, most diseases in the world that affect humans are tropical diseases, but almost no medications are developed for tropical diseases compared with other diseases. It's a matter of where the money is, and that's unfortunate. So anyway, you can talk and talk and talk and talk for all sorts of things, and certainly you don't want to get the sense. One of the things that you hear people say who really know, they say, look, Africa is not a country, and so it doesn't make sense to talk about what things are like in Africa. Right, plain and simple. There's everything everything that can be found somewhere in the world can also be found in Africa, right? In terms of wealth and poverty, industrialization, unindustrialization, great government, bad government, all of that can be found in Africa somewhere. And so don't talk about what things are like in Africa. That doesn't make any sense. You can talk about certain parts of it with much more precision than the whole doggone continent, right? Which is huge, right? So anyway, if you just take a look here, do you see two distinct worlds anymore, or do you see a kind of smear from year to year, right? And so all of this, we still talk, right, as if they're sort of first world and third world countries, and that hasn't been true for decades now, and continues to be less true every year that continues to go by. And I think the people that sort of think that sort of global poverty is this giant scourge that affects the majority of people who are outside a few lucky countries. Again, that's an outdated worldview. And if you really want to have hope about ending extreme poverty, just take a look at what has happened over the last number of decades, and it should make you very optimistic that extreme poverty could be even more substantially lessened than it has been. I mean, again, where it is a problem, it's a horrible problem and should not be made light of. But there is hope. There is absolutely hope, and there has been progress. The first step to knowing, this is a very Hans Roslingism, right? The first step to knowing about the future is knowing about the present, right? And of course, the past is relevant as well, but know about the present, certainly. And that's one of these what these things do. So now let's take a life expectancy. Instead of taking a look at family size, let's take a look at income for a second, right? And again, do you notice that there are all these rich countries and poor countries, or do you notice a kind of steady trend, right, from sort of one to the other, right? And again, richer countries tend to be healthier than poorer countries, but the difference isn't that extreme, actually, not as extreme as you'd think. So, for example, countries like the United States are making per person 50 times what countries in let's see, I'm looking for something right close to 1,000. Malawi is pretty close. Mozambique, for example. The United States has like 50 times per person the income of Mozambique, but they don't have 50 times the health outcomes. Okay, I mean the outcome is notable, but not 50 times, right? Not even double. It's very different. And again, child mortality and things like that are still an issue in some of the poorest areas of the world. And so fixing that can really fix a lot of other things. And so again, this is play around with this tool, right? You can see all kinds of really interesting and fun things. You can play around with these sort of maps and the trends. You can take a look at Hans explaining all sorts of things about world population, about wealth in the world, and about what your present is really like, because so much of the language that we use, so much of the thought that we have about how things are is very much outdated, and should definitely be replaced. So over the next several lectures, we'll be talking about how philosophy impacts the world itself, about how thinking about things differently, both not just in epistemology all by itself, or in metaphysics all by itself, or in value theory all by itself, but how putting all of those different kinds of lessons together can tell us things about how our world works, how to change it, and how to think about it more productively, and ultimately be better global citizens. Right? That's really the point of the next several readings. And so that's certainly something to focus on when you do that. And so with that, I encourage you to dive into those readings, read them carefully. They're fascinating. And as always, I'll be dropping a few videos to sort of walk you through some of those things and point out some of the most interesting and relevant features of those readings, so that you can get the most out of those that you can. And all of these are going to be essentially a preview, right, to the final paper really is going to be covering these last several readings. And I think this is a really important bedrock for those readings. And so that's that, and have a wonderful day.